Let's talk about this with Bel Trew, Chief International Correspondent at The Independent. Bel, it's been incredibly hard, hasn't it, for journalists who are having to tell this story, or all of this story, remotely, many of them.
Yeah, I mean, first of all, I think it's incredibly hard for the Palestinian journalists who are on the ground in Gaza, who are not just facing death themselves, and there is an unprecedented level of journalists who've been killed, the vast majority of the Palestinian journalists, but also facing the deaths of their loved ones, in strikes on their homes. So they are, of course, suffering the most, and that is incredibly important to say first. But second of all, yes, international journalists have not been permitted to be on the ground. And the Jodie Ginsberg, who's the CEO of Committee to Protect Journalists, which is the organisation you just cited, said it is unheard of that not a single international journalist has been able to get into Gaza for an entire year.
Other than those embedded
Gaza extensively.
Other than those temporarily embedded with the IDF.
Yes, other than those temporarily embedded with the IDF, of course. So, I'm just quoting her directly. Those are her words, and she says, it's the whole pattern and systematic attempts to censor what is happening inside Gaza. Yes, so you have journalists who've been able to access Gaza through controlled IDF embeds, which is a very different thing from being able to freely walk around and report. We had one journalist, Clarissa Ward from CNN, who managed to get very briefly into Rafah very early on to a field hospital hosted by the Emiratis, and that is it. So, and I've covered multiple Gaza wars from within Gaza. To not have access for so long is unprecedented, and it is very damaging to the amount of news that we can get out of Gaza. And this goes hand in hand with Palestinian journalists being killed, being maimed. There are 2 Al Jazeera journalists right now who are very critically ill, and the CPJ, the Committee to Protect Journalists, has been petitioning for their ability to leave Gaza for treatment. One of them, Fadi, is in a coma without painkillers, so they're injured, and they're also now being accused of being part of terrorist organization, which they feel is putting a direct target on their back. And it's a lot of these accusations against them have been found to be unproven, and I'm citing the CPJ here, who said that there's been a pattern of Israel making these kinds of allegations, with basically providing no credible evidence or no evidence at all. And they specifically talked about Al Jazeera correspondent Ismail Al-Ghul, who was killed. Israel released documents claiming to prove that he'd received a Hamas military ranking, but the documents were dated when he would have been just 10 years old. So we have to take those accusations with a massive pinch of salt and understand what's happening here, which is the censorship of news coming out of Gaza, at a very, very critical time in history of the Middle East.
And it's clear that sometimes on social media, there's been some excellent coverage on social media, but there's been some very partisan and questionable coverage on social media as well, because it can come from literally anywhere and you're not sure whose report you're seeing, who they are, what their provenance is. But there are some who you see repeatedly they are in different places and claiming to be different types of people, and they're so-called actors, conflict actors, whatever. That's one thing. But that itself presumably also puts a target on the back of proper journalists, real press people.
I mean, yes, there are targets on the back of real press people. And I think, we have enough evidence to show that. There are at least 128 journalists and media workers who've been killed, all but 5 of them Palestinian. And all of the killings except for 2 were carried out by Israeli forces. So that's just a fact from the CPJ. We're also seeing journalists being killed in Lebanon, which is the other front of the war. So we had Issam, who was killed last year in October. He is a Reuters journalist. He was on a hill that was far away from any hostilities. Human Rights Watch has released a deep investigation into that, calling it a likely possible war crime that the journalists were targeted. Christina, who works for AFP, her leg was blown off. I know these journalists. I've worked with them, and
you know them to be journalists.
Yes. Like, these are friends of mine and colleagues. Last night there was a bombing, an Israeli bombing of a compound, again away from any areas of hostilities, that was housing over a dozen journalists. 3 journalists were killed. Again, I know people who are friends of mine, who I've known for years, who are journalists who were in those houses in that compound. Again, I'm not. We have to have a fully independent investigation and see what happened there. But certainly, the journalists on the ground are saying that they felt that they were targeted. These are unprecedented levels of killings of journalists and mounting evidence. So, it's very worrying given that in Gaza specifically, when international journalists are not allowed to be there, we have no other voices than the Palestinian journalists on the ground, and they are operating in conditions that I can't even imagine.
And have you, in all your time covering conflict and wars, have you ever been to a place where you literally cannot get access at all?
It's very rare, and usually you can find some way. So, for example, at the beginning of the war in Syria, journalists were having to smuggle themselves across the border because obviously the regime wasn't going to issue visas. So, very often you have to use ways of getting into a conflict zone that may not be your standard arriving at an airport and getting your passport stamped.
Yeah.
But it is really rare. And I'm cycling through every instance that I've been through where access has been prohibited in such a final way. And also by a country that claims to be, a Western ally and a democracy that supports press freedoms. So those two pieces of information, I think, speak very, very loudly.
And they don't really hang together, do they? To be a Western-style democracy and not allow people into reporting your nation.
Because what's the problem with allowing us in? If you have nothing to hide, then why not allow international journalists in? And, I think, recently Israel has accused 6 Al Jazeera journalists in the north of Gaza of being affiliated with different, militant groups. Al Jazeera has vehemently denied those accusations. The CPJ, as I quoted, has come out with these statements. I think it's very telling that the north of Gaza, where these 6 journalists are reporting from, is now the site of a very, very intense ground offensive by Israel. So the only eyes on the ground right now that are there reporting on the impact on civilians of that ground offensive are these journalists who are now being accused of being basically part of militant groups and therefore fair game in terms of the rules of war. Again, I am not on the ground in Gaza. I have not investigated 6 of these journalists, but I can see a pattern here. And at the same time, we can't do our job as international journalists because we can't be on the ground. And we rely on our Palestinian colleagues who we've been working with for years. The journalists that I report with together in joint bylines who are in Gaza, I've worked with them for over a decade. I know who they are. I know their families. I know how they are not affiliated to any militant group, and I know what dangers they're under. And it's not just the rocket fire, the missiles or the ground offensive, but they're also fleeing. They're living in tents. They're operating in the kind of conditions that you and I would never, ever even imagine operating in. And they're still trying to get the story out, and they're facing accusations. And so altogether, this is I would say unprecedented.
Do you think that the previous, and there was an acceptance from UNRWA, wasn't there? And I know this is separate to journalism, but there was an acceptance by UNRWA that some of its staff had been hand in glove with Hamas and that they were investigating those individuals and working out what to do with them. Do you think that there's just a sense now that anyone who gets in the way is characterised as working with Hamas or another militant group? I mean, I know you can't say yes, that's definitely the case, but if it becomes a kind of MO by the IDF in this war, that really does endanger journalists, every last one of them, doesn't it? And aid workers.
Yeah, I mean, and also, by the way, we've had, Israel admitting that it's killed aid workers. I'm thinking of right now of the World Central Kitchen aid workers who I also knew who were also killed by drone strikes. So there is a pattern here. I can't, obviously I can't comment on every single individual and whether or not they have an affiliation with a militant group or not. But there is a pattern here of accusations and a pattern here of killing and a pattern here of demonizing particular organizations, including Al Jazeera and UNRWA. And to put this in context, UNRWA is basically the largest aid agency operating in Gaza. Before the war, it essentially propped up Gaza, like in terms of food, education. It was the largest UN aid agency there. It has thousands of employees. A lot of them are teachers operating in the UNRWA schools because the education system is basically, essentially, partly run by UNRWA, because the humanitarian situation in Gaza was so dire even before this war that everything was run by charities and aid agencies. So, it is one of the largest UN agencies. It has been operating in terms of providing food and education in a way that's kind of very different from any of the other aid agencies. And so demonizing it is actually quite dangerous in terms of the delivery of humanitarian aid or the process of responding to the humanitarian crisis in Gaza.
And you can, of course, accept that whilst also saying that it is important that aid agencies keep themselves separate from any organisations other than what they do. That's true of anywhere in the world.
Absolutely.
Yeah.
Obviously, of course. And as I said, I'm not going to comment on specific accusations because I'm not qualified to, but it's important to understand just how integral UNRWA's work was to propping up the civilian population of Gaza before and during the war.
Thank you.
And that no other aid agency was able to do the work they can do.
I must leave it there, but thank you very much for joining me today. Bel Trew, Chief International Correspondent at The Independent.